A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume. Book 2 of the Passions. Part 2 of Love and Hatred. Section 9 of the mixture of benevolence and anger with compassion and malice. Thus we have endeavored to account for pity and malice. Both these affections arise from the imagination according to the light in which it places its object. When our fancy considers directly the sentiments of others, and enters deep into them, it makes us sensible of all the passions it surveys, but in a particular manner of grief or sorrow. On the contrary, when we compare the sentiments of others to our own, we feel a sensation directly opposite to the original one, a joy from the grief of others, and a grief from their joy. But these are only the first foundations of the affections of pity and malice. Other passions are afterwards confounded with them. There is always a mixture of love or tenderness with pity, and of hatred or anger with malice. But it must be confessed that this mixture seems at first sight to be contradictory to my system. For as pity is an uneasiness, and malice a joy, arising from the misery of others, pity should naturally, as in all other cases, produce hatred, and malice love. This contradiction I endeavor to reconcile after the following manner. In order to cause a transition of passions, there is required a double relation of impressions and ideas, nor is one relation sufficient to produce this effect. But that we may understand the full force of this double relation, we must consider that 'tis not the present sensation alone, or momentary pain or pleasure, which determines the character of any passion, but the whole bent or tendency of it from the beginning to the end. One impression may be related to another, not only when their sensations are resembling, as we have all along supposed in the preceding cases, but also when their impulses or directions are similar and correspondent. This cannot take place with regard to pride and humility, because these are only pure sensations, without any direction or tendency to action. We are, therefore, to look for instances of this peculiar relation of impressions only in such affections as are attended with a certain appetite or desire, such as those of love and hatred. Benevolence, or the appetite which attends love, is a desire of the happiness of the person beloved, and an aversion to his misery, as anger, or the appetite which attends hatred, is a desire for the misery of the person hated, and an aversion to his happiness. A desire, therefore, of the happiness of another, and aversion to his misery, are similar to benevolence, and a desire of his misery and aversion to his happiness are correspondent to anger. Now pity is a desire of happiness to another, and aversion to his misery. As malice is the contrary appetite, pity then is related to benevolence, and malice to anger, and as benevolence has been already found to be connected with love by a natural and original quality, and anger with hatred, 'tis by this chain the passions of pity and malice are connected with love and hatred. This hypothesis is founded on sufficient experience. A man who, from any motives, has entertained a resolution of performing an action, naturally runs into every other view or motive, which may fortify that resolution, and give it authority and influence on the mind. To confirm us in any design, we search for motives drawn from interest, from honor, from duty. What wonder, then, that pity and benevolence, malice and anger, being the same desires arising from different principles, should totally mix together as to be undistinguishable. As to the connection betwixt benevolence and love, anger and hatred, being original and primary, it admits of no difficulty. We may add to this another experiment, that benevolence and anger, and consequently love and hatred, arise when our happiness or misery have any dependence on the happiness or misery of another person, without any farther relation. I doubt not but this experiment will appear so singular as to excuse us for stopping a moment to consider it. Suppose that two persons of the same trade should seek employment in a town that is not able to maintain both. 'Tis plain the success of one is perfectly incompatible with that of the other, and that whatever is for the interest of either is contrary to that of his rival, and so vice versa. Suppose again that two merchants, though living in different parts of the world, should enter into co-partnership together. The advantage or loss of one becomes immediately the advantage or loss of his partner, and the same fortune necessarily attends both. Now it is evident that in the first case hatred always follows upon the contrariety of interest, as in the second love arises from their union. Let us consider to what principle we can ascribe these passions. 'Tis plain they arise not from the double relations of impressions and ideas, if we regard only the present sensation. For taking the first case of rivalship, though the pleasure and advantage of an antagonist necessarily causes my pain and loss, yet to counterbalance this, his pain and loss causes my pleasure and advantage, and supposing him to be unsuccessful, I may by this means receive from him a superior degree of satisfaction. In the same manner the success of a partner rejoices me, but then his misfortunes afflict me in an equal proportion. And 'tis easy to imagine that the latter sentiment may in many cases preponderate. But whether the fortune of a rival or partner be good or bad, I always hate the former and love the latter. This love of a partner cannot proceed from the relation of connection betwixt us, in the same manner as I love a brother or countryman. A rival has almost as close a relation to me as a partner, for as the pleasure of the latter causes my pleasure, and his pain my pain, so the pleasure of the former causes my pain, and his pain my pleasure. The connection, then, of cause and effect is the same in both cases, and if in the one case the cause and effect has a farther relation of resemblance, they have that of contrariety in the other, which being also a species of resemblance, leaves the matter pretty equal. The only explication, then, we can give of this phenomenon is derived from that principle of a parallel direction above mentioned. Our concern for our own interest gives us a pleasure in the pleasure and a pain in the pain of a partner, after the same manner as by sympathy we feel a sensation correspondent to those which appear in any person who is present with us. On the other hand, the same concern for our interest makes us feel a pain in the pleasure, and a pleasure in the pain of a rival, and, in short, the same contrariety of sentiments as arises from comparison and malice. Since, therefore, a parallel direction of the affections proceeding from interest can give rise to benevolence or anger, no wonder the same parallel direction derived from sympathy and from comparison should have the same effect. In general we may observe that 'tis impossible to do good to others, from whatever motive, without feeling some touches of kindness and goodwill towards them, as the injuries we do not only cause hatred in the person who suffers them, but even in ourselves. These phenomena, indeed, may in part be accounted for from other principles. But here there occurs a considerable objection, which 'twill be necessary to examine before we proceed any farther. I have endeavored to prove that power and riches, or poverty and meanness, which give rise to love or hatred, without producing any original pleasure or uneasiness, operate upon us by means of a secondary sensation derived from a sympathy with that pain or satisfaction which they produce in the person who possesses them. From a sympathy with his pleasure there arises love, from that with his uneasiness, hatred. But 'tis a maxim which I have just now established, and which is absolutely necessary to the explication of the phenomena of pity and malice, that 'tis not the present sensation, or momentary pain or pleasure, which determines the character of any passion, but the general bent or tendency of it from the beginning to the end. For this reason pity or a sympathy with pain produces love, and that because it interests us in the fortunes of others, good or bad, and gives us a secondary sensation correspondent to the primary, in which it has the same influence with love and benevolence. Since then this rule holds good in one case, why does it not prevail throughout, and why does sympathy in uneasiness ever produce any passion beside goodwill and kindness? Is it becoming a philosopher to alter his method of reasoning, and run from one principle to its contrary, according to the particular phenomenon which he would explain? I have mentioned two different causes from which a transition of passion may arise, a double relation of ideas and impressions, and what is similar to it, a conformity in the tendency and direction of any two desires, which arise from different principles. Now I assert that when a sympathy with uneasiness is weak, it produces hatred or contempt by the former cause; when strong, it produces love or tenderness by the latter. This is the solution of the foregoing difficulty, which seems so urgent, and this is a principle founded on such evident arguments, that we ought to have established it, even though it were not necessary to the explication of any phenomenon. 'Tis certain that sympathy is not always limited to the present moment, but that we often feel by communication the pains and pleasures of others, which are not in being, and which we only anticipate by the force of imagination. For supposing I saw a person perfectly unknown to me, who, while asleep in the fields, was in danger of being trod under foot by horses, I should immediately run to his assistance, and in this I should be actuated by the same principle of sympathy which makes me concerned for the present sorrows of a stranger. The bare mention of this is sufficient, sympathy being nothing but a lively idea converted into an impression. 'Tis evident that in considering the future possible or probable condition of any person we may enter into it with so vivid a conception as to make it our own concern, and by that means be sensible of pains and pleasures which neither belong to ourselves, nor at the present instant have any real existence. But however we may look forward to the future in sympathizing with any person, the extending of our sympathy depends in a great measure upon our sense of his present condition. 'Tis a great effort of imagination to form such lively ideas, even of the present sentiments of others, as to feel these very sentiments, but 'tis impossible we could extend this sympathy to the future, without being aided by some circumstance in the present, which strikes upon us in a lively manner. When the present misery of another has any strong influence upon me, the vivacity of the conception is not confined merely to its immediate object, but diffuses its influence over all the related ideas, and gives me a lively notion of all the circumstances of that person, whether past, present, or future, possible, probable, or certain. By means of this lively notion I am interested in them, and take part with them, and feel a sympathetic motion in my breast, conformable to whatever I imagine in his. If I diminish the vivacity of the first conception, I diminish that of the related ideas, as pipes can convey no more water than what arises at the fountain. By this diminution I destroy the future prospect which is necessary to interest me perfectly in the fortune of another. I may feel the present impression, but carry my sympathy no farther, and never transfuse the force of the first conception into my ideas of the related objects. If it be another's misery which is presented in his feeble manner, I receive it by communication, and am affected with all the passions related to it; but as I am not so much interested as to concern myself in his good fortune, as well as his bad, I never feel the extensive sympathy, nor the passions related to it. Now in order to know what passions are related to these different kinds of sympathy, we must consider that benevolence is an original pleasure arising from the pleasure of the person beloved, and a pain proceeding from his pain, from which correspondence of impressions there arises a subsequent desire of his pleasure, and aversion to his pain. In order, then, to make a passion run parallel with benevolence, 'tis requisite we should feel these double impressions correspondent to those of the person whom we consider, nor is any one of them alone sufficient for that purpose. When we sympathize only with one impression, and that a painful one, this sympathy is related to anger and to hatred, upon account of the uneasiness it conveys to us. But as the extensive or limited sympathy depends upon the force of the first sympathy, it follows that the passion of love or hatred depends upon the same principle. A strong impression, when communicated, gives a double tendency of the passions, which is related to benevolence and love by a similarity of direction, however painful the first impression might have been. A weak impression that is painful is related to anger and hatred by the resemblance of sensations. Benevolence, therefore, arises from a great degree of misery, or any degree strongly sympathized with; hatred or contempt from a small degree, or one weakly sympathized with, which is the principle I intended to prove and explain. Nor have we only our reason to trust to for this principle, but also experience. A certain degree of poverty produces contempt, but a degree beyond causes compassion and goodwill. We may undervalue a peasant or servant, but when the misery of a beggar appears very great, or is painted in very lively colors, we sympathize with him in his afflictions, and feel in our heart evident touches of pity and benevolence. The same object causes contrary passions according to its different degrees. The passions therefore must depend upon principles that operate in such certain degrees according to my hypothesis. The increase of the sympathy has evidently the same effect as the increase of the misery. The barren or desolate country always seems ugly and disagreeable, and commonly inspires us with contempt for the inhabitants. This deformity, however, proceeds in a great measure from the sympathy with the inhabitants, as has been already observed, but it is only a weak one, and reaches no farther than the immediate sensation, which is disagreeable. The view of a city in ashes conveys benevolent sentiments, because we there enter so deep into the interests of the miserable inhabitants as to wish for their prosperity, as well as feel their adversity. But though the force of the impression generally produces pity and benevolence, 'tis certain that by being carried too far it ceases to have that effect. This perhaps may be worth our notice. When the uneasiness is either small in itself, or remote from us, it engages not the imagination, nor is it able to convey an equal concern for the future and contingent goods, as for the present and real evil. Upon its acquiring greater force, we become so interested in the concerns of the person, as to be sensible both of his good and bad fortune, and from that complete sympathy there arises pity and benevolence. But 'twill easily be imagined that where the present evil strikes with more than ordinary force, it may entirely engage our attention and prevent that double sympathy above mentioned. Thus we find that though every one, but especially women, are apt to contract a kindness for criminals, who go to the scaffold, and readily imagine them to be uncommonly handsome and well shaped, yet one who is present at the cruel execution of the rack feels no such tender emotions, but is in a manner overcome with horror, and has no leisure to temper this uneasy sensation by any opposite sympathy. But the instance which makes the most clearly for my hypothesis is that wherein by a change of the objects we separate the double sympathy even from a middling degree of the passion, in which case we find that pity, instead of producing love and tenderness as usual, always gives rise to the contrary affection. When we observe a person in misfortunes, we are affected with pity and love, but the author of that misfortune becomes the object of our strongest hatred, and is the more detested in proportion to the degree of our compassion. Now, for what reason should the same passion of pity produce love to the person who suffers the misfortune, and hatred to the person who causes it, unless it be because in the latter case the author bears a relation only to the misfortune, whereas in considering the sufferer we carry our view on every side, and wish for his prosperity as well as are sensible of his affliction. I shall just observe, before I leave the present subject, that this phenomenon of this double sympathy, and its tendency to cause love, may contribute to the production of the kindness which we naturally bear our relations and acquaintance. Custom and relation make us enter deeply into the sentiments of others, and whatever fortune we suppose to attend them is rendered present to us by the imagination, and operates as if originally our own. We rejoice in their pleasures and grieve for their sorrows, merely from the force of sympathy. Nothing that concerns them is indifferent to us, and as this correspondence of sentiments is the natural attendant of love, it readily produces that affection